When considering focal length, the most important thing to understand is that the lower focal length numbers are wide. In this case, this zoom's widest number would be 24 millimeters, and the higher focal length numbers are long. So wide-angle lenses give a wider angle of view, while long lenses give a narrower angle of view. Typically, your classic zoom lens on a APS-C, which is the standard sensor size DSLR camera, will have a focal range from 18 to 55 millimeters. 35 millimeters is considered the normal focal length, which means it's about the same as you would see if you peeked over the camera with one eye opened. 55 millimeter is sort of approaching longer telephoto ranges, while 18 millimeter will give you a wide angle of view to get big groups into your picture or a large interior space. If you're using a full frame camera, then the close equivalents to these focal lengths would be 28 as wide, 50 as normal, and 75 as long. And the reason for that difference is not really important right now. Now, it's common for people to say certain lenses are appropriate for certain types of photography, but really, while that might be true if you're trying to emulate pictures you've seen, a lot of these sayings are often, or assumptions I should say, I think can often be counterproductive. For example, this picture is taken with a wide angle, an 18 millimeter lens, which I often have people will ask me, should I get a wide angle lens for landscape photography? And sometimes a wide angle lens can be helpful for landscapes, but in most cases, like this one, I think the picture is much better when you can focus in on the landscape, which in this case to me looks like the spraying water that kind of snakes like a river, the house in the distance. To me, these make the elements of a landscape. A picture like this, or an engaging landscape I should say, in a picture like this taken with a wide angle lens, I have so much foreground to distract me that I barely notice this incredible spring, which is really the subject of the picture. Just to review, this one was taken at 18 millimeters, while this one was taken at about 70 or 64 millimeters. Another picture, this picture of pelicans taken in Monterey, California, is one of my favorite wildlife pictures that I've taken. And this was taken with a wide angle lens, with a 20 millimeter lens. And had I had a long lens with me, I probably would have kept a distance from the birds, isolated them with a blurry background, and if I was lucky, I would have gotten a picture that maybe looked like something I'd seen before. But by being forced to use a different focal length, I think in this picture I was able to create something a lot more exciting and engaging. So here we have an effect that you might recognize from the film Jaws called the dolly zoom effect. And I show this because I think it illustrates well how focal length changes our perception of background. I'll just play this one more time. We can see the subjects more or less stay the same size while the background kind of shrinks behind them. So here we have a scene of two people, Hao and Tahan, standing in front of a train. And we're going to change our perspective on this scene a little bit. Look at it from above. So now we can see Tahan and Hao. We can see this sort of yellow rectangle which shows the frame of our picture, and then there I am, the photographer, in front of them. So where I'm standing, in order to photograph that frame, I would use a wide-angle lens, which would give me a view sort of like this. So you can see Tahan and Hao have a good amount of space on either side of them, but looking towards the background, we can see quite a bit of the train. If I were to stand further back and use a longer lens to create the same composition, you can see now the angle of view is much narrower, and we have a similar frame around Tahan and Hao, but in the background, much less of the frame shows in the picture. And if we look at the pictures now that were taken from those 2 points, you can see that effect play out. So for this exercise, what I would like you to do is to pick a subject and try to align that subject in your frame. Back away from the subject as much as you can and zoom in on it with your longest focal length, and then walk towards the subject as you zoom out, so that you end up photographing the subject along every angle of view available on your zoom lens. Now, I think it's important to start with the long lens and walk towards your subject, rather with the wide lens and walk backwards. As you can see in this example, for the longest lens picture, I'm standing in a road, so it's better to be walking forwards rather than backwards and not seeing what's behind you. A surprising amount of photographers meet an ill fate that way. So for this shoot, you want to have the mode on your camera set to program, which means that aperture and shutter speed will be chosen automatically, and you'll also have your ISO automatic, your white balance automatic, and have the image quality set to RAW. So really, we don't need very many manual controls on this. Focus should also just be autofocus, manual focus, it doesn't really matter. You really just want to see the difference in the focal length. And after making these pictures, we're going to put them together into an animated GIF, which will sort of emulate that dolly zoom effect. And here's another example here where rather than framing a central subject, we've turned the subjects into the frame so we can kind of see the space changing, really see how that background changes in the frame that's their arms. The reason that we're going to put these together as animated GIFs is it really will give you a good indicator of how precisely you've aligned the images. You can see here when we look at the 4 images next to each other, we do see differences between the images, but they're much less pronounced than when we see it animated. Also, certain details like how well background objects, like in this case the red door, are aligned will be really conspicuous when the image animates. So you'll know whether to reshoot again. Getting it precise will really not only, I think, give one a deeper understanding of the difference between focal lengths, but also just helps you to really look carefully at every element of what's in your viewfinder, what's in the middle, what's at the edges, and what is the line of sight, what is that central object in the background. Looking through the camera, I have the lens zoomed to the longest focal length, and I'm going to carefully line this object up so it actually touches the top and bottom of the frame, which will really give me the best sense of consistency from one frame to the next. So there's the picture right about there. And now that I've got that framed, pardon the jiggling, I'll zoom the lens out a little bit. And now I'm going to move the camera forward to reframe the picture. This act of touching and there's the picture right there. So by keeping the picture lined up with the top and the bottom, or the subject I should say, lined up with the top and the bottom of the frame, it allows me to make sure the composition is the same every time. So here at the wide angle, we've got another shot. And you'll notice when I move the camera side to side a little bit that the window frame in the background really gives me a good sense of perspective, so I can see that my pictures are correctly centered every time. Having imported our pictures into Lightroom, the first thing I'm going to do is put these pictures into a collection that corresponds to the assignment, or in this case, exercise. So I will select all these pictures by clicking the first one, holding down Shift and clicking on the last. And then in the library module, I go to the section that says collections, and I'll just hit this little plus, create collection, and I can call it exercise 1, or focal length, or both. Now here in the collections, I'm looking at these files. So what I may choose to do is go through these files and maybe decide keeper, not keeper, keeper, or not keeper and keeper, and then use the filtering section to edit this selection down to just 3 pictures. Though in this case, I'm actually going to use all of them. I don't see any errors in this photo shoot. So I'm going to grab all the pictures, select all of them, and now I'm going to the export dialog. Here I'm going to choose a specific folder to put this in. Actually, let me backtrack. So here, I'd like you to always export to the same folder. So I'm going to choose a folder. I'm going to pick the hard drive that we're using for this class. And inside the folder that has my Lightroom catalog, I'm going to create a new folder called Export. And that's where we'll be sending all our export files. I think it's really useful to have that, even if you want to move files to different places for different projects in the future, having that export folder I think is a really good intermediate stage in one's workflow. So here you can set a subfolder, which I'm going to call EX1. Now, the export dialog gives us some really cool functions. Like here we can automatically rename files. So I'm going to rename these files focal, for focal length, and I'm going to have it number them. I have other choices here. I can choose also not to rename it, or I can set up some sort of custom setting where I have custom text, a sequence number. I could add the original file number to the end of it. I could add things from the metadata. So for instance, I could add, I'm looking for the date here, I could add the ISO that each picture was taken at, and you can see here this name for this file is getting very complex. This can be useful for some things. I find working for a client or something, it's helpful to just have a simple file number with a simple order of numbers. Also, if you've edited your pictures for a client or someone you're working with and you've removed certain pictures, you don't want the file numbers to reflect that. You don't want them asking to see pictures that you've decided don't represent your work well. So by renumbering them, just choosing a sequence of numbers here, that can really help. Here for the image format, I'm going to keep these images as JPEGs. Color spaces are interesting. For now, all you really need to know is ProPhoto RGB has the widest color gamut. sRGB has the widest range of compatibility. So if you're sending your image to be used on the web or for unknown purposes, you can use this older, more primitive color format, or it's actually called a color space. We'll leave the quality here at 89, and we will resize our image. So you have the choice to set your size based on megapixels, based on setting an edge dimension, which is what I'm going to do here. Or you can actually uncheck this to export things at their native resolution. Because our goal here is to make an animated GIF, I'm going to keep the resolution really low because these are images that are really just made to view in a web browser or on a mobile device. So I'm going to bring the long edge of the files down to just 1000 pixels. Here, resolution, pixels per inch, is really irrelevant because this file is only going to exist on screens. Pixels per inch only really matters if we were going to print it, or if our dimensions were in inches or centimeters. We don't need to do any sharpening, we don't need to worry about metadata, watermarks, etc. So we will show this in the Finder. And I'll hit export, and this should go relatively quickly. So now we've got our files right there. And to put these together into a GIF, we're actually going to keep it simple. We will learn a little later in the class how to make more advanced GIFs and animations in Photoshop, but for the time being, we're just going to use a web app. And in this case, I'm going to use this one called GIF Maker. I simply select Upload Images, navigate to that folder, select all the files, and there we go. So right now the animation is very slow, but by decreasing the amount of delay between frames, we can see this kind of interesting dolly zoom effect now happening through their arms. Now I'm noticing here that the pictures aren't quite in order, which is a nice feature of this app that it lets you order them. So I'm just going to sequence these properly. So we got the little door, it gets progressively bigger. And there we go. Now we have a much more smooth vertigo effect going on there. So here we can simply click Create GIF Animation. And now we have the option to download or view the GIF. If you want to post an image like this on Instagram, Instagram doesn't support GIF, so you would want to create a video animation, which you could then upload. So there we go, there it is, and we can simply drag this file. Oops. I can rename it. Exercise number 1. And the file is now ready to upload. And for uploading this assignment, you don't need to upload any of these individual JPEGs. The only thing I need to see is the GIF. And the reason for that is I think making an animation out of this really will show you how precise you're being with your composition. When you look at the pictures out on a grid, you can see differences in them, but animating really shows you how precise you were or weren't with your camera work.